I watched a recent Prime Minister's Questions. It wasn't Wednesday's session, but a few weeks ago. And the SNP leader in Westminster, Stephen Flynn, pressed the Prime Minister on UK support for Israel. And uncharacteristically, Starmer got quite agitated. Now, whether you like Starmer or not, he usually keeps his cool. And on this particular occasion, you could tell he was a little bit rattled. You could tell that he was quite frustrated, and his response to Flynn was, "I will never apologise for giving up on diplomacy." That's not verbatim, but that's what he was driving at, i.e., this big focus on diplomacy. Now, on the surface, there's something noble in that. Favouring diplomacy over bombast, favouring diplomacy over conflict. On the surface, that seems like a noble position to take. But when it conflates with naivety and complacency, then I'm not so sure that it is that noble. I think it's actually borderline reckless. I mean, we could say that Neville Chamberlain had good intentions, but good intentions will never make up for realpolitik and the situation that we are in. And I think that is the situation we are now in with China. China is not a friend. China is a threat. And the sooner this government realises it, the better. Now, with all the heat on Labour over this, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact the Tories' own record was far from ideal. It was David Cameron's government that introduced the so-called golden era of Sino-British relations. What I think we've been seeing consistently from British governments is that when they're in opposition, they talk about getting tough on China, and when they're in power, they just go flimsy. I'm not suggesting that we absolutely cut off ties with the world's second biggest economy. In fact, some measures even suggest China has overtaken the United States. Depends what metric you look at, but regardless, it's effectively a superpower. So I think it would be premature to just completely cut off all relations. But what we shouldn't be doing is giving the regime in Beijing ground to believe that they have the upper hand or that they can push us around. So there's a lot of sources here, and I for time reasons I'm not going to read out all of them, or I'm going to read them out in an abridged format. But this is not a scandal that's going to go away anytime soon, referring to the two men who've been accused of espionage. Now, in the interest of total fairness, both men, both named Christopher Cash and Christopher Berry, have insisted on their innocence. And I believe that everyone deserves due process. I don't know if those men are guilty or not. They insist that they're innocent. But what is absolutely certain is that China has nefarious activity in this country, as they have in other Western countries, in Canada, in Germany, in Australia. This is something that the Beijing regime has been doing for years. And look at their response today regarding the mega embassy. I'm just going to read out the headline from The Guardian. This report is by Kieran Stacey and Eleni Correa. This is today, the 17th of October. China threatens UK with consequences over delayed London mega embassy. They're not saying they're disappointed. They're not saying they hope that things can progress faster. They're saying there will be consequences. That is how Beijing conducts foreign policy. Threats. Anyone they deem to be weaker than themselves, they threaten. They're bullies. The Chinese Communist Party are a pack of thugs. And that is how they conduct foreign policy. I mean, we're talking here about a G7 country, the world's sixth biggest economy. If this is how they talk to the United Kingdom, imagine some small Pacific nation that doesn't do their bidding. This is how Beijing operates. They have an entitled sense that they deserve respect by sheer virtue of their power. So go read out a bit of that report. Then I'm going to look at a report from a few days ago, the 13th of October, actually an op-ed by Anne McElvoy in the I newspaper. There's a lot of stuff going around, so I'm not going to read out everything, but I think this is important, and I do think this is an issue that is not going to go away. I'll actually go so far as to say this is an issue so important, I think potentially it could collapse the government. I mean, if Harold Macmillan was brought down over the Profumo scandal, this is arguably on an even bigger scale, so we'll see what happens. But this is from The Guardian today. I'm not going to read out the whole thing, I'll put a link to it just for time reasons. I want to abridge it a little bit. But anyway, tensions between Britain and China have escalated after Beijing criticised further delays to a planning decision on its proposed mega embassy in London. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs expressed grave concern and strong dissatisfaction after Steve Reed, the Housing Secretary, pushed back his final decision on a proposal until the 10th of December. The row further complicates attempts by Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, to reset relations with Beijing, which is a grave mistake in my opinion, which have already been damaged by a row over alleged Chinese espionage in the UK. Lin Jian, a spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, told a press conference in Beijing on Friday that the UK had shown disregard for contractual spirit, acting in bad faith and without integrity. He said China had acted with the utmost sincerity and patience, and the UK should immediately fulfil its obligations and honour its commitments, otherwise the British side shall bear all consequences. All consequences. Clearly a veiled threat there. The Prime Minister's spokesperson told reporters on Friday that the decision over the embassy was quasi-judicial and independent of the rest of government. He said he did not recognise any claims of commitments or assurances. I mean, this is how the Chinese regime operates. They think that every government mechanism works the way they do, like absolute control on decisions. It doesn't work that way. Conservative MPs have accused ministers of breaking the law by giving China private assurances that they would wade through the proposed complex, which at 20,000 square metres would be the biggest embassy in Europe if it goes ahead. I'm not sure if that means biggest Chinese embassy or biggest embassy overall. Oliver Robbins, the head of the Foreign Office, is in China this week discussing the embassy application and the refurbishment Britain wants to carry out in its own embassy in Beijing. The Guardian revealed last year that China was refusing to let the works go ahead while the fate of its own embassy is being decided. Starmer has been keen to improve relations with Beijing as he seeks foreign investments to help build big infrastructure projects in the UK, but those attempts have faced multiple hurdles, including the two recent rows over spying in the proposed new embassy. Beijing bought the site of the prospective embassy near the Tower of London for £255 million in 2018. Tower Hamlets Council refused permission for the project in 2022, credit to Tower Hamlets Council, prompting wrangling over whether it could go ahead. China resubmitted its application shortly after Labour came to power, and Xi Jinping raised the matter directly with Starmer in their first call in August 2024. Starmer told Xi on the margins of the G20 summit in November 2024. He raised the Chinese embassy building in London when he spoke on the telephone. We have since taken action by calling in that application. Now, what Starmer should have told Xi Jinping is, Mr. Chairman, we are not going to go ahead with this so long as your government threatens British MPs. That's the sort of assertiveness that Starmer should be showing. And yes, it will take guts. Yes, it will take political courage. But he has to stand up to Xi Jinping. I will, to say this in the interest of total fairness, at that G20 summit, Starmer did raise the issue of human rights publicly with Xi Jinping, and then Chinese security people were pushing away journalists. But this wasn't in China. This was in Rio de Janeiro. So you had Chinese security people trying to silence questions from British journalists in covering the British Prime Minister and the Chinese leader in a third country. This is how the Chinese regime operates. They're bullies. Look at what we've got going on. We have a spy case. We have threats over the extension of an embassy. This is the sort of regime we're dealing with. 250,000 British citizens died from COVID, a pandemic that I believe spread because of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. The fact of the matter is they punished the whistleblowers instead of immediately acting to contain this. Now the world just seems to have moved on and said, we'll let it go. But the entire world suffered because of because of the nature of the Chinese government's threats towards the whistleblowers, the way they handled that initially. I think China's got away with it, quite frankly. The entire world suffered. The aviation industry suffered. The entertainment industry suffered. Millions died. Millions more were made sick. And I don't say the Chinese Communist Party caused the virus. What I say is they didn't do enough to contain it. And in the context of all of this, in the context of the threats in other countries, the fact they stoke up nationalism among the Chinese diaspora, with all of this, Keir Starmer thinks we should just have a reset. Now, Starmer's approach to world politics seems to be that in general. Reset with the EU, which I welcome. Get on well with Trump, so we have lower tariffs. I think Starmer's view is if we just please the Chinese, then that will kind of get them on side. This is either an astonishing ignorance about the nature of the Chinese regime, or it's a very risky strategy, or, worst of all, it is a massive, massive scandal where Starmer is actually selling out this country's national security for the price of trade, and that would be utterly unforgivable. If there's some major cyber security attack and it is pinpointed to China, that will fall on Keir Starmer. I think that it is one of the most unforgivable things a government can do is willingly compromise national security. Now I'm going to read out a little bit from Anne McElvoy's op-ed in The Eye. This is from the 13th of October. Again, I'm not going to read out it all because just for time reasons. By now it is clear to anyone whose main news source is not China Daily that the Prime Minister's got himself into a tangle over the handling of the alleged Chinese spy case, specifically while a trial of two British citizens accused of passing sensitive information to agents of Beijing was abandoned. It is now easier to count those satisfied with the government's threadbare explanation than the growing number of senior insiders expressing doubts and frustrations over the dropping of the court case. Highly unusually, the head of the Crown Prosecution Service, which was of course Starmer's own job some years back, Stephen Parkinson, has made clear that prosecuting teams repeatedly failed to get the government to confirm that China posed a present threat to the national security of the UK. Had the trial gone ahead, Christopher Cash, a parliamentary researcher, and Christopher Berry, a teacher working in China, would have had the opportunity to defend themselves. They insist they are innocent. So arguably, ironically, these men have been denied due process by the trial collapsing. But the trial did not go ahead, and number 10 and officials close to the PM now stand accused of having been the block. Suspicions fall especially in National Security Advisor Jonathan Powell. The head of the CPS has practically told us so. Efforts were made over many months, Parkinson said, but notwithstanding the fact that further witness statements were provided, none of these stated at the time of the offence China represented a threat to national security. He concluded when this became apparent the case could not succeed. For whatever reason, the enemy description disappeared from the statements in a manner Beijing would welcome. Why? Why did the government downgrade that? In truth, this legal definition is not clear-cut. Numerous sources in the Foreign Office, intelligence services and government tell me that China clearly is an enemy, in that it repeatedly and aggressively targets the UK with cyber and human espionage to a degree that extends far beyond the norms of intelligence gathering governments practice on each other. Sometimes governments avoid saying so openly, but they choose their own words. China's recent espionage and South China Sea activity seems to me to be hostility towards the West. It is just a matter of whether one chooses to call a spade or digging implement with whom we wish to have a nuanced relationship. The third angle that matters is discerning the real reason all of this came to a head, cutting out all the blather and White House BS. As one former intelligence chief put it to me, the government ran scared of this trial, upsetting Beijing before Starmer heads out on an investment visit next year. Now to me that is very glaring. That they didn't want to embarrass the superpower. That they basically pandered to China's sensitivity, China's opposition to the trial. That is really, really glaring. What irks me is the lack of candour about the real reasons behind dropping of the trial. Democracies deserve better. The government should be more mindful of that. China invests in the UK not to please a transient Prime Minister, but because it is cash rich and seeks know-how from investments in the West. Inward trade was £70 billion in 2024. Exports were a mere £28 billion, i.e. less than half of that. The UK wants to work on trying to get China to take more UK goods and services, but that aim now collides too forcefully with sundry warnings that Britain is seen as a weak partner, which will not strike back when its interests are attacked. And I agree with this analysis. This is the danger. Now, she does go on to defend Powell. I've known Powell for decades and always found him to be astute. He is rightfully feted as the author of the Good Friday Agreement to bring peace to Northern Ireland and the master of the grinding complexity behind it. His professional life out of government has behind-the-scenes deals on conflict resolution, which aim at getting the best for both parties. It is nonsense to describe him as in some way in hoc to Beijing for some self-interested purpose. He is simply making a judgment on the UK's options. Okay, so he may not be personally corrupt, but is that judgment incredibly naive? If she's known him for years, how does she explain this? But it is also okay and often necessary for a leader to question the beliefs and biases of their associates, however close they are. One way or the other, it's a fiasco that has ended up attracting more attention to the machinations of the British deep state than the declared benefits of Chinese cooperation. If this is successful statecraft, I am a peace-loving Chengdu panda. So that's McElvoy's take on it. Another report also talks about Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, who's one of our MPs here in Sunderland. I actually met her a few months ago, but she was visiting the local Ukrainian group. She told the BBC that Powell did not have those conversations around the substance or the evidence of the case regarding the case of the two Christophers. Okay, so I'm going to just summarise this as I see it. I don't think this is going to go away, and I think that Kimi Badenoch, as the leader of His Majesty's opposition, should keep pushing this until she is blue in the face. No puns intended. But she should, really. This is an issue of national security. We have a government that basically stands accused of putting trade before national security. That is unforgivable. Now, of course, the government will forcefully reject this. Starmer's coming out with this argument that he can't interfere in the process. And I know the government minister in the... It wasn't Prime Minister's questions, it was another Commons hearing on this, said, well, the Tories on one hand accuse of us interfering in the trial, now they're saying that we intervene. The bottom line is this. Starmer wants to visit China next year. We have British MPs, elected parliamentarians who've been targeted by China. We have repeated warnings by the security services of Chinese espionage. So does Starmer really think that we could just deal with China like any other country? He has questioned human rights issues, and I give him credit for that. But he really, really needs to push the Chinese on national security. And the fact that they're lashing out because they're not getting their own way should tell us everything we need to know about this regime. I accept that it isn't easy to stand up to China. It's daunting. It is a superpower. They have a very large military. They're a nuclear power. They have either the second or biggest world economy. So it is daunting to stand up to China. But when Keir Starmer ran for leader of the Labour Party, he knew there would be a chance that one day he is in number 10, and he is. That's enormous responsibility. And there's arguably no bigger responsibility than national security. So in taking on that job, frankly, it takes guts. It takes someone who is not afraid to stand up to our adversaries. And the problem we have with Labour is they look soft on China. And incidentally, there's Labour MPs who have raised concerns. Emily Thornberry was raising concerns about this. I think that Starmer... I mean, the thing is, he keeps getting himself into a trap, because if he now calls off this visit to China, it will look like he's only reacting after the facts and, doing it from pressure to the criticism. So what we see with this Prime Minister is always reacting to criticism rather than being ahead of it. And it's where Badenoch could actually get some ground. I'm not overly impressed by her as Tory leader, but I do think she's right to push the Prime Minister on this. Her own party's record was far from perfect. Again, I feel one of our better Justice Secretaries in recent years Dominic Raab as Foreign Secretary, he did, in fact, recall the Chinese ambassador over the Hong Kong protests, and they did take quite a strong stance on that. But it was a Conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron, that brought Xi Jinping to this country for a state visit and heralded in the golden era relations. It was George Osborne who basically put aside any criticism of human rights in order to put trade first. Now, Labour hasn't ditched the human rights criticism completely, although they have moderated it a little bit. They vowed that when they were in power, they would designate what's happening to the Uyghurs as a genocide. That's been rolled back. I think there's just too many signs here of a government that is scared of offending Beijing, and that's unacceptable. I want to see Keir Starmer being more outspoken. I want to see him vocally and publicly saying it's unacceptable for China to threaten British MPs. I want him to say that to Xi Jinping's face. And the Chinese can kick up a stink. This is what they always do. They lash out. We all know about the wolf warrior diplomacy. It's really, it's either my way or we will threaten you. That's the tactics of a bully. China is a global bully. And it's about time we realise that. I don't say we cut off all relations, but how can we deal on an equal footing with a country that threatens us when they don't get their own way? So, I am very, very unhappy with the way the Labour government is approaching China. The reset? We don't need a reset. We need a tougher stance on China. If anything, that's the reset that we need. Not more appeasement, cowardly appeasement, unacceptable appeasement. Because that's effectively what it is. If Starmer is saying we're going to, push aside all this stuff in favour of trade, my question to the Prime Minister would be this. Mr. Prime Minister, are you taking seriously what the security services have told your government? And if you are, why are you going ahead with a visit next year? Why are you not publicly criticising Beijing for interfering in this country? Why are you not publicly condemning Beijing for threatening British MPs? Why have you not banned Confucius Institutes? It's absolutely unforgivable. I don't care if it's 100 billion. It doesn't matter what the cost is. No trade is worth national security. It just isn't. So I don't say we cut off all ties with Beijing. What I would welcome is shoring up trade deals with other countries. I mean, to give the Prime Minister some credit, he has worked hard to have good relations with India. I don't entirely trust India. I don't trust Narendra Modi's coziness with Putin. But I would sooner that we done trade with India than China. At least in the case of India, you can understand it. You can understand the shared heritage. And India, for all its faults, is not China. It is a democracy. And I would rather we were close to India right now than China. Now, I should also put a caveat in all of this. In no way am I a xenophobe. I've worked with Chinese students. And I don't attack China, the country. I'm attacking the Chinese government. I don't say that we should discriminate against Chinese nationals. So Chinese students who want to study here, Chinese tourists, even Chinese business people, although in the case of Chinese business people, they are by definition in hock to the Chinese government because they have to be. They've no choice. That's the way the Chinese system works. But Chinese tourists, Chinese students, I say come to the UK, enjoy yourselves. But I do think that if people come to this country and disrespect this country, if they go around waving the Chinese flag and threatening other students, for example, I think they should lose their visa. That's the sort of thing, that sort of so-called soft power areas where we could be more assertive on. Because right now, I think China sees the UK as a soft touch. That is unacceptable. I think the Chinese see Canada as a soft touch. The only country that China perhaps is a little bit scared of is the United States. And for all Trump's bombast, this is one area where I think his bombast might be actually useful. Because if we get a world where China is the hegemony, that will have sinister implications on absolutely everyone, frankly, on Earth. Because the power that China will have, for example, potential control of the internet, if not absolute control, certainly partial control, it's sinister. we just cannot be complacent about this issue. And I think not just Kimi Badenoch, but frankly, all of the leaders, Farage, Davy, they should all be hammering the government on this, really putting them under a microscope, force the government to take a harder line on China. I think if Starmer goes ahead with this trip next year, I mean, in a way, he's got himself in a spot, because if he goes ahead, it looks like appeasement. It looks like doing that at a time when there are so many questions over our national security. But if he doesn't do it, it will look like he's had to cave in to critics. So he's got himself in a hole. Why arrange that visit in the first place? I know what Starmer will say. It's always better to put diplomacy over adversity. But how many indications do we need about the nature of the Chinese regime? It's not like Xi Jinping is a new leader. This is a dictator who's been in power for over a decade. We know the nature of his regime. So this idea of a reset, it's a bit like the same naivety around Putin in the 2000s. You cannot trust the Chinese regime. Another big thing, I would add, the government's taken a very strong line on Ukraine. Well, China has been supporting Russia. It's been supplying essential components. And we've also seen Chinese nationals fighting against Ukraine. Now, whether they're individual recruits or China's actually sending them there as state policy, I'm not actually sure that is it, because it's limited numbers. We're talking about a few hundred, and the PLA is like 2 million strong, so I don't think that's it. But China is a country that we can't ignore. It's a country that we do need to work with on some level. Let me just give an example. Let's say there was a ship hijacked off the Red Sea by Somali pirates, and that happened to involve both British and Chinese interests. It would make sense to work together. If there's some big natural disaster, say an earthquake or a typhoon, and Britain is sending humanitarian aid, we'd have to work with the Chinese in that sort of area. On climate change, we need to work with them. So I'm not saying we absolutely cut off all links. And naturally, if a British citizen was in trouble in China, the Foreign Office has to use diplomacy. I understand that, but the same applies the other way. What we do need to show the Chinese government is that bullying won't get them what they want. I think China responds to countries they perceive as weak, and we have basically two choices. We either go along this current route, which in my view is a serious mistake, or we start standing up to them. Now, either way, China will look at it in a belligerent way anyway. If we keep pandering to them, they'll think we're a soft touch. If we stand up to them, they'll lash out. But I think we should stand up to them, because when they lash out, they will expose what they really are. I mean, it's this classic philosophy around bullies. I'll give them what they want and they'll go away. But it doesn't work like that. If more countries stood up to China, they would back down. They're powerful, but they're not all powerful. And if a small country like Lithuania could stand up to China, we sure as hell can. Or we should. So, I am frankly, I'm disgusted with this government's attitude to China. And it is not something that's going to go away anytime soon. If there's some major security breach, then it's going to be on Keir Starmer's head. I think it could collapse the government, and frankly, they deserve no better, because compromising national security is unforgivable. Really. And there's just too many questions right now. It was far from rosy on the Tories' watch either, but Labour seems to be going even further. We haven't had a state visit to Britain by any Chinese leader since 2015, 10 years ago. My concern is Starmer's going to then go to Beijing and invite Xi Jinping or another senior Chinese party, Communist Party official to come here. That would just be, at this time, when we have so many security questions, the optics of it would be disgraceful. And if I have, I always say I vote on parties for different reasons, but if I have one reason right now not to vote Labour, it would be this. I think they are really being pushed around by China, and it's unforgivable. Starmer needs to be more vocal. He needs to publicly say we will not tolerate any attempts to interfere in our democracy, whether it be from Elon Musk or from China. He needs to publicly say that. His reluctance to do so speaks volumes, because it looks like a government that is desperate not to offend a superpower. And that just means we're being pushed around by a bully. I've lived and worked in China. I have some idea what this regime is like. It's a wonderful country. It's a wonderful culture. But it is run by a pack of thugs. That is the nature of the Chinese communist regime. We can't trust them, and we should only work with them where absolutely necessary. We should not be pandering to them. We should not be giving them what they want. The mega embassy shouldn't go ahead. Let them have a tantrum. And yes, there will be reciprocations in Beijing. So be it. So be it. Let's look at shoring up trade with other countries. There's plenty of emerging economies in the world we could be getting closer to. This over-reliance on China, I don't accept it's absolutely necessary.